Jesus Christ was not just a teacher, not just a rabbi, but the greatest youth pastor of all time. Though history has often depicted his disciples as aged men with long beards and solemn expressions, the reality is far more radical. The evidence strongly suggests that Jesus' disciples were mostly teenagers, young men still in their formative years, handpicked by the Messiah to be the foundation of his kingdom. If this is true, then Jesus' ministry was, in many ways, the greatest youth ministry the world has ever known. Like a youth pastor, Jesus didn't seek out the religious elites or established leaders. He called fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary boys from small towns, young men still learning their way in the world. At an age when most Jewish males were still under their father's instruction, Jesus invited them into something greater. He didn't just teach them about faith, he showed them how to live it. He guided them in truth, shaped their character, and prepared them for their future roles as leaders of the faith. His approach to discipleship mirrors modern youth ministry in many ways. He didn't just lecture them, he walked with them, ate with them, laughed with them, and lived life alongside them. He led them into deeper spiritual understanding through stories and parables, challenging them to think differently. He pushed them to question traditions that had become empty rituals and encouraged them to stand firm in their faith, even when it made them outcasts. Like any great youth pastor, he saw their potential before they saw it in themselves. Jesus' disciples weren't ready-made leaders. They were rough around the edges, prone to doubt, and sometimes immature in their thinking. James and John wanted to call fire down from heaven on those who rejected them. Peter spoke boldly, but often acted rashly. Thomas struggled with doubt. They were young, impulsive, and often confused. But Jesus was patient, knowing that with the right guidance, they would grow into the men they were destined to be. Another mark of Jesus as the ultimate youth pastor was his ability to create a deep sense of community among his disciples. They were more than students. They were a family. They ate together, traveled together, and faced hardships together. Jesus invested in them, corrected them when they failed, and celebrated their victories. He built a bond with them that would carry through even after his death and resurrection, a model of the relational discipleship that youth ministries strive for today. More than anything, Jesus empowered his young disciples to carry on his mission. A youth pastor's goal is to prepare young believers to live out their faith beyond the walls of the church. Jesus did the same, but on a far greater scale. He didn't just equip his disciples with knowledge. He sent them out to preach, to heal, to perform miracles. When he ascended into heaven, he didn't leave them as students. He left them as apostles, entrusted with spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. But while Jesus resembled a youth pastor in many ways, he was far more than that. Unlike modern youth pastors who operate within the structure of a church, Jesus had full authority. He wasn't just teaching about God, he was God. He wasn't just leading a youth group, he was fulfilling prophecy, establishing a new covenant, and laying the foundation for the church itself. His disciples weren't just members of a youth ministry. They were world changers, pioneers who would take his message to rulers, nations, and generations yet to come. Understanding that Jesus' disciples were likely teenagers shifts the way we see them. They weren't the wise, elderly men of Renaissance paintings. They were young, passionate, sometimes reckless, and still growing. They made mistakes, had moments of doubt, and asked a lot of questions. Yet, under the guidance of the greatest teacher they could ever have, they transformed into bold preachers of the gospel, willing to die for the truth they had come to know. This also makes sense of why Jesus often called them children. It explains why John, the last surviving disciple, lived well into his 90s, because he was likely just a teenager when he followed Jesus. It reframes their story, not as one of seasoned theologians, but of young revolutionaries being mentored by their rabbi, their teacher, their savior. If we view Jesus as the greatest youth pastor of all time, then his ministry becomes even more relatable to the world today. He didn't wait for the perfect, the polished, or the highly educated. He chose young men who were still figuring things out and turned them into the pillars of the faith. He walked with them through their doubts, their failures, and their growth, and ultimately, he entrusted them with the greatest mission of all, to take his message to the nations. Jesus wasn't just raising up a youth group. He was raising up the future of his church. And in doing so, he proved that young people aren't just the leaders of tomorrow. They are the leaders of today.